All right. So my name is Robin Staines. For those who don't know me, I'm the president of Advance Illinois, and I am really excited to be here with tonight for our annual Legislative Forum. And we do this in partnership with so many other organizations. And I'm speaking slowly so that you can actually absorb, because this is only slide one of all of the organizations. So you got all this, and yet, wait, there's more. And the reason that we all come together is that we all know when you're in legislative session, it's a busy time. And there are topics that command a little bit more attention, a little time, a little opportunity to unpack. The other people who get credit for this very timely topic, which I'm going to reveal in just a moment in case you didn't already know, are Legislative Host Committee. And I really want to thank Representative Carol Ammons, Senator Terry Bryant, Senator Dale Fowler, Representative Barbara Hernandez, Representative Norma Hernandez, Senate Majority Leader Kimberly Lightford, and Senator Sally Turner. Thank you so much for helping us think this through and to get this organized. And the topic that's on everybody's mind is higher education funding. Can we create a more equitable, adequate, and sustainable approach to how we fund our public universities? And the good news is that just less than 2 weeks ago, the Illinois Commission on Public University Equitable Funding just released its report and recommendations. Some of you may have already dug in and you've read it. Show of hands if you've read the whole report. All right, extra dessert for you guys. Find somebody who didn't and take theirs. But for those of you who haven't, that's exactly why we're here. It's a lot. It's a lot to try to absorb, and so we're going to take some time to talk about what are the issues that prompted that commission to get stood up in the first place? What are some of the critical challenges that one might address in our public university funding? And what recommendations did the commission come up with, and what path forward is it that we can be considering and working on as a state? That's a lot to cover. I'm going to walk you through. We're going to be kicked off by Representative Carol Ammons. In just a moment, I'll introduce her. I'm going to give you a little bit of an update. I'm going to walk you through that report, the challenges it lays out, the recommendations it puts forth. Then we're going to have national experts talk to us about what do they think about what we've come up with. They look at this stuff all across the country all the time. They know everything there is to know. What do they think about what we're imagining here? And then we're going to hear from local leaders and students and university folks. What do they think about the issues that we're facing and what we can and we might do? And our hope is that by taking a minute over some food, over some drink, with people that you know or get to know, that we are going to be that much more informed leaving than you were coming in on an important, relevant, timely topic. So thank you for being here. And I also want to thank Representative Norma Hernandez, just had to leave. Representative Mussman, so glad to have you here. Representative, champion of education all the time, Representative Blair Sherlock, thank you for joining us. Representative Hirschauer, thank you for being with us. Representative Favor-Diaz, who's getting sick of me right about now. Representative Yang Rohr, wonderful to have you, thank you. Senator Fowler, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to introduce Representative Ammons in a moment. Don't even clap for her now. You're going to give her a bigger round of applause in a second. And Senator, okay, there you go. See what I did? And Senator Kimberly Lightford, who was actually going to be closing us out tonight, had a family emergency. And so please send her good thoughts her way. I know she sends her apologies. But then I'm going to invite up to get us kicked off the person who absolutely should be kicking us off. Representative Carol Ammons doesn't need any introduction in a lot of places. She probably doesn't here. But she, as you all know, is the representative of the 103rd District. That is also the home to the flagship University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In addition, she is the chair of the bicameral Black Caucus. But what I think really makes her the most appropriate person is that she co-chaired the commission that took a look at public university funding. She authored and sponsored the bill that stood up that commission. And she did so because what she brings to this work is a belief that every young person can and will succeed and fly if they're given a fair chance. and that we have not done all that we can yet as a state to make sure that every young person has an opportunity to shine. And she has dedicated her life personally and professionally to making sure that that happens. And she's relentless. I love that relentlessness. I love that passion. And I love the brains that you bring to that work on top of it all. So please, Representative Ammons, if you would kick us off.
What a privilege to be in relation with such a powerful woman as Robin. And all of you know that already, but I have learned so much from her. I'm simply a student of this work, and I'm blessed to be in it with you. And all of those who participated in this 2-year-long process. It would take forever for me to name all 33 members of the commission, but we are so blessed to have had your expertise. There is no way that we could have gotten to this point without you. So I wanted to acknowledge you this evening. Good evening to all of you who have joined us tonight, and thank you for choosing to be here, because we've already spent an entire day at the Capitol working on so many important issues, but then you decided, to my colleagues, to come and do some more work this evening. Thank you all so much for making that decision. So it goes without saying why we are here today. We're here to discuss public higher education system in Illinois and how the state funds this critical pathway towards greater socioeconomic mobility and stronger outcomes for our students, their families, and our communities. The last 2 years has been real work. We have worked on an important initiative that I believe, honestly, will change the landscape in Illinois. I'm reminded of the great work of Dr. King, and he was interviewed one year, and he talked about the importance of education, and not just education, but access to it. And he's quoted as saying, education must enable a man or woman to become more efficient, to achieve with increased facility the legitimate goals of his or her life. And for so many generations before me, this was not a true statement. But we intend to make it true today. And I have to admit, it is both ironic but also heartening that while efforts across the country are working to scale back access to all kinds of things, and I won't waste your time naming them all, in Illinois, we decided that college access and equitable access to it is the important step that we can take in light of what the Supreme Court has said to us around this issue. The Supreme Court of the United States knocked down affirmative action in college admissions. Illinois, though, is approaching this very differently. We're going in the opposite direction. We decided that we would invest. That's exactly right. We decided that we would invest more in our institutions of higher education, strengthening their ability to sufficiently support and serve racially and economically diverse student groups to and through college. It's one thing to engage them in college, but it's another thing to keep them there and help them to make it through. But first, to provide some background on how we got here, in 2021, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, our advocates across the state, all of us experienced a traumatic experience with the murder of George Floyd. And in the absence of Leader Lightford, she took our caucus, she was our joint chair at the time, to a historic step. And she said, we're not going to just look at criminal justice reform. We're going to look at how we can change the landscape for people going into the future in all issue areas that impact their lives. And education certainly is one of them. So we took that historic step toward higher education equity in drafting, with my wonderful advocacy groups in this room, legislation that we passed and signed into law as Public Act 102-0570 during the 101st General Assembly, of which many of my colleagues here tonight voted for that legislation. That legislation created the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding, which was a critical step in acknowledging that the state can and must develop a more equitable, adequate, and sustainable approach to funding its four-year institutions. But it must do it, understanding how critical this work has to be for our students, to the whole state, and especially students have been consistently and historically marginalized. Illinois remains one of a few states that does not have a funding formula for higher education system. We took this up in K-12 and look at the landscape. The commission's work, though, a 33-person commission was elected, and some people laughed at me and said, there is no way you're going to get a commission to sit down with 33 people and come out with a report where we did get agreement on majority of the items that we studied through that process. We evaluated our current funding methodologies and the impact of that. In Illinois and across the country, we looked at other states' funding formulas. We looked at higher education spending and programming before we made the recommended alternatives that you see before you in the report. What is important in this process, it cannot be understated. The commission did its homework. Together, we dug through data, lots of it. We talked with students. We worked with other state leaders and community organizational heads and higher education policy experts, the provosts, the presidents. We talked to everybody about what we were trying to do. And the outcome of this, it was an approach that anchored us in what it really costs to be effectively educating students at the university level, taking into account the different student populations and programs at each public university. What did we find? We found some current inequalities in our system. That's what we found. We listened to the experiences of our students who were grappling with how to afford college and looked at the cascading headlines discussing declining enrollments and the prohibitively costly expense of attending higher education for low-income Black and brown students. That became an important point for us to consider. The data told us a lot of stories that the state of higher education that we have in Illinois was something that we needed to re-examine. The commission was tasked with recommending what our advocates are calling a blueprint for a more equitable funding model for Illinois' public university students. We looked at the data very closely. Our enrollment declines is what really started this process. The data is clear. Inequality is something we cannot tolerate in Illinois. We must give every single student an opportunity to succeed. I'm sure that you would agree that our enrollment and attainment trends are alarming, and you will learn more about that tonight. But they will also represent a great opportunity for us. If we can strengthen access and be persistent, we can reverse the declines. We can level the critical playing field that education provides for us. The students, the university, and the state will benefit from what we do collectively together. In the next few months, you will learn more and more and more about the commission's work. You will see the data for yourself. We didn't make it up. We weren't targeting any particular university, and we certainly were not trying to defund anyone. But what we did learn, and what you will learn this evening from our expert panelists, is you will hear from students, you'll hear from national experts, you'll hear from commission members who will share their experience about our funding model that we looked at, as well as other states. And you will also learn the key recommendations that came out of the 2+ years of work that this commission put in. On behalf of Leader Lightford, who is not able to be with us tonight, we thank you deeply for all that you've already given, and we certainly thank you for what you will give towards a more equitable funding model for the state of Illinois. Lastly, it's only right that we begin by hearing from those who are most impacted by the work that we will do and the work that we have done, and that is from the students from Illinois. We have a short video that will be played for you. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy your dinner, and I hope you learned something like I have. Thank you.
All students, regardless of their socioeconomic background, race, or ethnicity, must have access to a supportive, affordable, high-quality public higher education in Illinois. The Commission on Equitable Public University Funding, housed within the Illinois Board of Higher Education, has furnished recommendations to the Illinois General Assembly for a formula to equitably appropriate dollars amongst the state's public universities.
I chose to pursue a college degree because growing up, I watched how people who went to college, they had access to better resources and ultimately ended up having a better quality of life. And college is extremely important to me because just a few generations back, many people in my family were not allowed to attend certain colleges due to racial barriers.
The reason why I wanted to attend school was because I wanted to be able to pursue my dream in public health. The reason why was because I didn't think this would be achievable. Being undocumented meant that I didn't know if I had the privilege to go to school. Fortunate enough, I was able to apply for DACA and be able to attend school. But with that came a lot of barriers. Coming from a family that is low income, I had to work multiple jobs just to be able to go to school. Having to also not attend school a lot of times because I wasn't able to pay for the classes.
I decided to pursue college to open up opportunities where I can support my parents and also help improve their quality of life and also create a path for my younger siblings to follow. I faced many challenges when it came to pursuing a degree, one of which was being low income. I had to work multiple jobs during the summer and the winter to support myself, as well as support funding my book, my tuition, and my housing. And then another struggle was navigating federal support. It was really hard for me to navigate FAFSA my first time. I had no one to reach out to, no one to ask. So I really wish I had someone that was there to help me with that.
I believe in an equitable funding formula because every student deserves the right to adequate resources. College is important to me because of the opportunities. I'm a first-generation American and a first-generation student. My parents and I believe that getting some sort of education would grant me access to job opportunities as well as connecting to my community.
Why I will advocate for a funding formula centered on equity, with student voices as the leading driver in informing the work. In the wake of the 2023 Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action, it is more important than ever that students in Illinois have access to a high-quality education. And that begins with ensuring all public universities have adequate resources to support students of color, first generation, and low-income students.
I want a special shout out to Jorge Ortega and the Young Invincibles. Jorge, can you wave your hand? This is the world premiere of this video. And that is exactly where we should begin. So again, I'm gonna come back up here to do the fun part. So I also had the pleasure of serving as a member of the commission. So I'm gonna walk you through as quickly as possible, and I think I've got this down to 12 minutes and 12 seconds, what the challenges were that we addressed, and the recommendations so that we're all anchored on that common knowledge when we turn to have the conversation with our local and our national experts. We're going to talk about the equity gaps that drove this, the historical inequity gaps, how they developed, and what it means to develop an adequacy-based funding model, and some of the next steps. I think we can all agree, and we can applaud, or you can hold up your drinks. Illinois' future depends on having a higher education system that is well-resourced and that is able to provide high-quality programs to every student, no matter the background, from every corner of the state. There you go. Just want to get you used to clapping when you see me. Earning a college degree continues to be a game changer for families, communities, and the states. And I'm shocked all the time when some people say otherwise, because the research is really clear and it's been absolutely consistent for decades. Earning a degree pays off for students and their families. Positive economic outcomes. You're more likely to be employed. Your earnings are going to be higher. Better quality of life. More likely to engage in the community. Better health outcomes, if you can believe it. And intergenerational benefits, which are demonstrable and have been demonstrated time and time again. But unfortunately, higher education is out of reach for far too many students. The cost is no longer affordable, and universities don't have what they need to provide the services that students need to succeed if they manage to make their way there. And you can see those equity gaps emerge at every state, including before kids even get to college. We know that we have not been equally funding all of our K-12 systems. So some kids are coming from radically different funding backgrounds. That's disproportionately true of students from low-income households or from underrepresented groups. So you see disparities in high school graduation, which follow into enrollment, which follow all the way through to graduation and on into employment. So increasing equitable access and success in higher education is critical, and it involves us dealing with both state financial aid and institutional funding. And I want to explain why they both matter. Financial aid, we got to get money into the pockets of kids, make sure that they've got what they need to access the place of their choice. But institutional funding matters just as much, because we need to make sure that institutions are ready to meet those students when they get there. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways this plays out. When institutional funding declines, as it has in Illinois, our support, state support for our universities, has dropped by 46% in inflation-adjusted dollars in the last 2 decades. 46%. Now, what happens in any state where this is true? Tuition goes up. That money's got to come from somewhere, and if the state isn't going to shoulder that, that shifts the burden to students and families. And that's exactly what has happened in Illinois, where average tuition rates across the states have nearly doubled from where they were in the early 2000s. And this is true any state you look at. You drop your funding, tuition's going to go up. Now, MAP helps. It has an important role to play. And back in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, MAP covered all the costs of attending a four-year public university. Go team! Now it covers 55%. And it's only up to 55% because we've worked hard in the last few years. So you can see we are squeezing out students. So when we talk about the enrollment cliff, I want you to keep in mind, an enrollment cliff is only a cliff if we don't think more broadly and creatively about how to support more students to have access. So this is the backdrop that we're working against. If we don't get enough money to institutions, affordability is going to become a problem because tuition will go up. Net price to students, not just the tuition and fees, but housing and other things are going to become a greater burden. And high quality services that we know, evidence-based practices that are going to help students from a broader range of backgrounds be successful won't be available because institutions won't be able to afford them. So the way we fund our public institutions makes all the difference to student success. We control this. Many things are out of our control. This isn't. Research shows that an additional investment in higher education positively affects student outcomes, access, enrollment numbers, persistence, time to degree completion, and the number of students who earn those degrees. Enrollment, persistence, completion. We can control that by investing more. And targeted supports, research-based, targeted supports that are critical to student success depend on that funding, and they pay disproportionate benefits to students from underrepresented backgrounds. So they matter for everybody. They matter especially for students from low-income backgrounds, first-time goers, students of color, English language learners, and more. Institutional resources, we were able to take a look. Representative Ammons mentioned that the commission did a lot of looking at, well, what do we know about what it costs to educate a student well? So you want to look and see, well, what are the programs that have a research base of success for students, and what do they cost? And how do we figure out what those costs associated? We know that it matters to have counseling and mental health supports and career advising, cultural centers, academics, targeted academic supports, access programs, and that when we provide those, students do better. But there are costs associated. And what you want to do is factor those things in and have a student-based approach to what we should be spending. But that is not what we do currently. Our current formula is out of date. It's historically been inequitable. And the way we do it, when we do across-the-board increases, it bakes those inequities in more deeply. We don't factor in the actual costs currently that it takes to adequately and support students. We don't consider the different needs of different students who are coming from different backgrounds with different levels of preparation, in part because we may have underfunded their high school. It's largely driven by political negotiations. I know, am I right? It matters, right? It shows up. That stuff doesn't magically erase when you move from high school to college like it never happened. It's largely a political process. You all know this. Anybody here from a university, you go and you make your case as best you can to the General Assembly. You beg and you plead, and you hope you get what you need. And more recently, what's happened is we just do across-the-board cuts or across-the-board increases. So if there was an equity coming in, that equity gets continued. That's what we've been doing. And as a result, and you can see here, these are real universities hidden, so to protect the innocent. This is what universities are able to spend on academic and student supports. Notice how big that gap is. Currently, it's about a $7,600, $7,700 per kid gap in the academic student supports available, depending on the university you attend. And what's shocking is two things. One, it's gotten worse over time. So on the left, that was how it looked in 2002. There were gaps. They weren't good. It was a $3,500 gap. It's now, in 2021, a $7,700 gap. So it's getting worse. If we don't deal with this, it's going to continue to get worse. And if that's not shocking enough, I'm going to show you something that it should shock you. It sadly probably won't. Look at who attends the different universities. There is a much higher concentration of underrepresented groups. This is specifically underrepresented minority students at our less well-funded universities that are less able to spend dollars on the programs we know will work. That's got to change. And the good news is we do now have a roadmap for how to do that. We can create a funding system that provides adequate, equitable, stable funding. Repeat that after me. This is our mantra. Adequate, equitable, stable. You got to do all three, right? You got to do right by the students. You got to do right by the institutions that are serving them, and particularly those who have been disproportionately serving them. So the commission got charged with adequacy. We should really understand what we should be spending. What does it mean to be more equitable and make sure that we are taking into account those differences across students? That it is stable, that universities can predict what they're going to get and do the planning and the hard work that they need to do to meet those students where they are. And then finally, we haven't talked about that as much, but is every bit as important is the accountability and transparency. If we're going to invest in a significant way, if we're going to make a big change, we got to know that it's going to make a difference. How are those dollars going to be used? Are they going to go where they're meant to go and support the students they're meant to support? So that's the last piece of the puzzle, but not the least important. So the commission proposed a preliminary model. And again, you're all going to go read those reports. They're fabulous. It's a wonderful, easy 80-page read. Keep it by your bedside table. Or there is an explainer. It's a cheat sheet sitting at every person's place. It's beautiful and it's easy to follow. And if you don't want to read all 80 pages, these are the 6 pages you want to look at. So they did a couple of things. The first thing they did is they say, well, we should know what each institution to be spending. What is their adequacy target? That's the phrase we're going to use. That seeks to quantify the cost of providing students with a high-quality education we know that they need based on their individual student population. So we started first by looking at what are we currently spending, and we know we've been underspending. What are the adjustments that we ought to be making? If we look at a whole range of data points, other states, et cetera, we can come up with what the basic adequacy cost is that we should be spending for an average student. And then we can adjust that. That's the equity adjustment. We know it doesn't cost the same to educate every student. We can actually put some dollar figure numbers on that by looking at some of those research-based programs. What do they cost? And then trying to identify, based on your student population, what additional amounts you would need to spend as a university to do right by them. And if you bring all that together, we will understand both what we're currently spending, what we should be spending, that's the adequacy gap, the institutional adequacy gap, or institutional adequacy target. I knew I shouldn't have had that glass of wine. And what you see in that blank, that's the gap. That's the gap between what we're currently spending and what we now have a way of understanding we should be spending if we want to serve our students well. And just to dig in one more space, because you're going to want to know about this, what went into that adequacy target? What did we consider? We looked at the cost. It costs money to recruit and to enroll, and particularly if we care about closing gaps, we want universities to have funding to reach out to a broader array and support those students. You heard that student saying, I needed somebody help on FAFSA. I didn't know the ISAC fellows, anybody who's in the room, you guys were out there. I don't know how she missed you or you missed her, but it costs money to do that and really bring students in. So access programs, academic supports, those non-academic supports I spoke about a minute ago, the core instruction, which is the beating heart, but also the specific missions that different universities have. It's different to be a Research 1 than a Research 2 than a Research 3 institution. We understand that. It's different to offer engineering programs than it is to offer other kinds of programs. We took that into account. And then we considered operations and maintenance, including that it costs a different amount to run universities at different size points. That helped us construct the adequacy target. But the other thing we have to look at that we also look at, if this is sounding familiar for those who know K-12, we took a similar approach in K-12. Note to self, or spoiler alert, lots more complicated in higher education. We took a look to see, well, what can individual institutions currently afford? What are they currently getting in state appropriations? What is the expected tuition and fees they can count on? And then what are some of the other resources they can access, be it grant dollars or endowment figures, et cetera. Lots to discuss on all of that. And then you look, the dotted line, that's the adequacy target for an institution. The bottom, what they can currently afford, and that gap, that's what each institution, we can now do that on each institution and understand what their particular gap to adequacy is. This is the reason you're all going to go to the report, is you can find this slide. You can find this deck, which shows you, based on what the recommendations are from the report, this tells us where every institution in Illinois, what they should be spending, what they currently have available, and what their gap to adequacy is. And you can see that the range ranges everywhere from 39% of adequacy to 92% of adequacy. So we've got work to do. Everybody needs more, but some people are further away than others. The last thing then that you're all going to want to know about is the allocation formula. So now that we've got a way of understanding, right, we can see, and again, these are real places, 45% of adequacy for one institution, another one's at 56, another one's at 92. We understand what that gap is, what they should be spending. That's their percent, but we've got actual numbers behind that. Then we're going to want to figure out how to allocate, and you do the allocation based on a combination of the absolute and relative size of the university's gap from adequacy. But the bottom line is what you're trying to do is the universities that are furthest from adequacy, you want to catch them up the fastest, right? They've got further to go, and you're going to want to figure out how to allocate dollars to push them forward faster without doing harm to other institutions. So the formula, the allocation, it's more complicated than I can go into tonight, but you can ask me afterwards. I'll one more glass of wine, and I'll be telling you everything I know. But there is a methodology for doing that is trying to balance the needs of universities and getting the people who are furthest up fastest. You're probably interested in what this costs. I know I was. And here's what we ended up coming up with. Based on the projections, the model that we've got in place that's in the report, for $135 million a year, the conclusion of the commission was that it should steal a page from K-12. There should be an agreement about what the annual allocation ought to be if we want to do this right. At $135 million a year, that gets all institutions to full adequacy in 10 years. If we can only spend $100 million a year, that would get us to full adequacy in 15 years. We have currently been putting in somewhere between 60 to 88, I think was the high point in the last couple of years. At $60 million a year, we would not get to full funding in 15 years. The state adequacy gap would decrease from 32% to 22%. So we're going to have some decisions to make. First, we need to understand the formula and support it. The second, we're going to have to decide at what level, how fast, how far, how important is this? Can we make this happen? The last piece, and I told you it was the last but not the least important, is accountability and transparency. There is much less accountability and transparency in higher education than there is in K-12 coming into this. And when we were doing the K-12, I think people felt comfortable, like we're really paying attention. We know what's going on. We've got a lot of indicators. We've got a lot of data. That's not as true here. So this was an important part of the conversation, and a few critical precepts came out. One, it's critical that we be transparent. We understand where those new fundings are going, that there be spending plans, and there to be much more illumination on how dollars are used. Two, we should pay attention to timing. If you're 39% of funding, we got to expect things differently from you than if you're at 92%. We need to give that 39% university a chance to catch up, get to a certain funding level before we start paying attention in a different way to their outcomes. Not that you're not going to pay less attention, but it takes time and it takes resources. You want there to be accountability on all the things that we're talking about: enrollment, affordability, closing gaps, persistence, time to completion. Those we're going to be paying attention, and again, needs to be better data, more readily available and usable by both decision makers and lawmakers, families, and all of us in the field. Effective and equitable outcomes, meaning we don't want to take money away when you're having a problem. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but we do want to be mindful about what can we do to make sure that we're encouraging universities in a path to improvement, and then a holistic review. We've got 12 institutions that allows us to take a deeper dive and to look more individually at each of them, where they're coming from, where they're going, and what they need, so that you can put in place different kinds of accountability mechanisms and ones that are designed to be supportive, not punitive. closer monitoring spending, category reporting, more direction in how you use fund, and maybe holding back on the next new round, but not taking away. So we've got a roadmap, and the discussion to now is going to be, how good is that roadmap? Because you've just heard me say it, I'm enthusiastic, I feel really good about this, but I may have been brainwashed after 2 years of doing this in a room with probably these same 33 people. So let's hear what some national experts say, and I am really excited to delight to join me. Why don't you guys come on up while I am introducing you? I'm going to have a conversation first with Dr. Kayla Elliott and Brian Prescott. Dr. Elliott, and we have been talking to them repeatedly over the last few years. They are super brainy. And the number of people who know higher education funding inside and out, it's not a huge list. It's an illustrious list, as you can see, very glamorous. But it's not a huge list. Dr. Kayla Elliott, right, is, and you've got her bio at your table, is the Director of Workforce Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, known as America's Black think tank, which I love. She has also worked as the Director of Higher Education Policy at a little place called the Education Trust. She has also taught at universities in her home state of Florida. She is a very proud third-generation historically Black college university graduate from Fisk, not the third at Fisk. She's made it clear to me. So we're delighted to have you, Kayla. Welcome. I forgot to mention the coalition, I'll come back to that. And Brian Prescott, who's the head of NCHEMS. And I say that so often I've forgotten what it means, but it's the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, which just rolls off the tongue. And what that really means is he knows a lot about the wonky side of running universities, and he advises people regularly. He's been doing this for a very long time. We consult with him from time to time as well. We have found him to be incredibly knowledgeable, very balanced. Really delighted to have you both join us to help us take a hard look at what it is that we've got in place here. They've both read the report, so they're ahead of many of you. So they actually know what they're talking about. And with that, I'm going to move over here and we're going to start the conversation. Did I give them a chance to clap for you, Brian?
No,
you guys clap for Brian. How can you clap for Brian? We can't have that. We can't have that. All right, so Kayla, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to start on a strange topic. I'm going to zig before we zag back, which is many of you are aware that Illinois embarked on performance-based funding in higher education. We gave it a teeny tiny drib jab of money, but many other states have been doing that, and they've been doing that now, some of them for 10, 15 years. That is not where this report went. And I think my first question is, why? Is it a bad thing that we're not doing performance-based funding? That was decided, that was a very considered decision. Do you agree or disagree, approve or disapprove, and why?
I agree and approve. And I've got some colleagues in the room, one of whom I joked around with, and he's like, well, you don't like anything. Yeah, it's very true. I don't. He's got it in the back. Yeah, my approval, my standards are very high. My approval comes with knowing and seeing the hard work that has been done here. So the commission has been at work for 2 years. My first trip here to talk about performance-based funding was in 2019, to talk with folks from Advance Illinois and Partnership for College Completion and Women Employed and Young Invincibles and all the other great groups that are in the room, and I recognize a lot of familiar faces. They have been at this for a long time, listening to people like me say what's good and what's not and what works and what doesn't. And Robin doesn't know this, but I went back and looked at a report that I wrote in Ed Trust in about 2019, and there were 10 recommendations on if you are going to do a funding system, performance-based, outcomes-based, adequacy-based, whatever you're going to do. If you're going to do a funding system, here are 10 things that you need to do. I went through this work and realized that they were meeting nine of the 10. And they are, again, lofty. I said very high standards. And the one that is missing, she leaned over to me earlier today and said, I've been thinking about campus climate surveys. And that is the one thing. And so even though it may not be baked in there now, it is clearly, like finding some way to say, are we not just enrolling students? Are they not graduating? But are they actually being included and treated well as also? Because that's super important. So all of that to say, I think it is a good thing that we are not doing performance-based funding here. There are many pitfalls to the states that have been at this for 10 years, 15 years. Tennessee's really been at this for decades. And some of the clear mistakes that we saw in performance-based funding around equity, around instability, around the rich getting richer, right? And those who had few resources remaining, and just creating more of the same. Like, why put the time and resources into a new system that does the exact same thing you already were getting, right? I think the recommendations I had to fix performance-based funding, I didn't realize at the time meant we couldn't do performance-based funding anymore, and needed to be doing something different. But I think performance-based funding really created in some states a lot of competition between institutions to all be excellent or to all create certain behaviors, right? Not just outcomes, but behaviors. And every institution should be set up to serve its own unique purpose, right? Whether it's a rural institution, a regional institution, an urban institution, whether it is a real like conduit for transfer, right? Like whatever that, like, we can have a whole different conversation about like community colleges in 2 years when the commission gets there, right? Around like serving
Brian's
the
very
local.
excited about that. Brian Durham.
Really, now that I'm where I'm at, like let's have a good conversation there, right? Like thinking about workforce needs and what it means to like serve the community and serve the needs of the state.
All right, so it was a good decision to go in the adequacy-based. So Brian, I'm going to switch to you. You've actually been consulting with a number of states that are also starting to move away from performance-based approach and to think about an adequacy-based. In fact, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, because I can get excited and overstate things. But I think this really is where the field is going, is toward an adequacy-based approach. We may be one of the first out of the gate to actually do that. Don't we want to be the first out of the gate to do this? Do we not want to be? Challenge accepted, am I right? What do you like about that approach? And as you're looking at how Illinois is trying to tackle that, what are you seeing? You're like, that's square and that's right on the money. And then after we talk about what you like about it, I'll give Kayla a chance too, then we'll turn to things that you would caution us about or be concerned about. But let's start with the good stuff.
Sure. First off, thanks for letting me have the opportunity to come and talk to you all this evening. We have been doing work at NCHIMS and a number of other states on funding model reform. And I can cite particularly the cases that we've been engaged in Virginia and Missouri, talk a little bit about those in more detail. But we're seeing this as a general increase in interest among states to sort of take a step back, look at the likely future we're facing in higher education. I'm going to invoke the demographic cliff analogy here and agree with Robin that is oversold. Because there's people we're leaving on the demographic cliff addresses a particular group of students we've traditionally served. But that being said, there's a number of states that are saying, hey, do we have our funding infrastructure set up to meet the moment that we're entering? And there's been a lot of attention to this across states. A lot of them don't know what they want, but the formulation that we're increasingly seeing is some version of what we've been calling adequacy funding. And so what Illinois is doing and what Missouri, I think that right now the race is on between Missouri and Illinois, to be honest with you. It's really interesting too.
You've got Missouri. Am I right?
Right?
Am I right?
I mean, here you have a bright blue state and a pretty red state, and trying to get after
which is actually
funding,
fascinating.
Which is really fascinating, right? So, we're seeing the need to sort of address the challenges we're entering now and of the future in a way that sets institutions up for success to meet the needs of the state and of communities in light of the changing likely enrollment, the changing profile of enrollment demand as we go forward. And so, things that I like particularly about the thing that Illinois is doing is. One, having a real sense of what the differential missions of institutions, and that's baked into the funding model in ways that are both readily apparent and less so. So in Robin's slides, you saw mission as one of the things that generates costs. And so that would account like for UIUC's research activity relative to what Chicago State or Governor State has, which is much smaller or relatively not very much at all. So that's a clear mission differentiation. But it also shows up in terms of what programs are being offered to what students. Very clearly in the way in which the funding model tries to provide resources to account for variation across institutions in the needs of the students they serve, to achieve the goals of equity, and to meet state needs as we see demographic change happening. and to account for variation in the costs of offering programs that are high cost relative to low cost. Getting at that part really helps institutions plan for offering programs that are in high demand, like nursing, which costs the institution more to deliver, but you may not necessarily want to charge students more to take, because that presents another barrier. So you eliminate the disincentive for creating and expanding some of these programs that tend to be in high demand and also have high costs. And at the same time you're doing that, you're thinking about what are the needs of the populations we want to serve them through some of those programs, which I actually think that's deep in the weeds of what the funding model that you're presenting has, which is really cool. Like we don't want just any student in these high cost, high demand programs that are going to pay off in high wage jobs. We want that population of students that go into those programs to mirror the proportion of students that we see in our state as well, which I think is really kind of a cool thing. I'll stop there. There's a lot more I could say on that subject.
Well, that's good, because that leaves Kayla some things for you to say that you like about this. And we will get to the things we're worried about, but more on what you're liking.
Yeah, so I mentioned those 10 metrics earlier.
By the way, you had not told me that before, and I'm very excited, and we really are 10 for 10.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned those 10 recommendations, right, and solutions for funding models before. And again, 9 of those already it baked in, and really not just baked, but seasoned, because that matters, right? That definitely matters. So I think one of those things is that we should not take for granted, and that I will applaud you all on, is the really explicit and dogged dedication to equity, to being very real about what students and families and communities in this state are facing. And to who and what and how we need to move folks forward into higher education, right? Being very clear about the equity gaps for Black and Latino students, adults down the line, being very clear about what those gaps are and addressing that in the funding model. Way too many states are bashful about it or eliminating it altogether.
And yeah. Can I just interject? When you read the report, as you're all going to do, you'll see that those gaps, we didn't just say, well, these are gaps, we didn't just suppose them. We actually looked at what the data was telling us. Where are there gaps in enrollment? Where are there gaps in persistent? Where are there gaps in completion? And so the report is completely fact-based, right? It's not a political agenda being applied. It was, look, let's just take a look. And wherever we're seeing disparities, that's where we're going to want to be able to provide additional supports.
Absolutely. So making that explicit, making that mandatory, putting that truly at the center, I think cannot be understated. I also like the timing of the recommendation. So the idea that institutions are held harmless, in the first year or so of adopting into a system, the idea that they're given enough time to adapt the necessary systems, processes, staff, capacity, in order to get this crunching numbers requires quite a bit from an institution. And so recognizing that and potentially providing some of those resources is super important. But I also think about the way that we're structuring the funding. One, I'm from Florida. I like to pick on Florida quite a bit because their performance-based funding system, especially at conception, was particularly awful. One of the things was it could change from year to year, right? Sometimes we change a metric every year, we change the funding model every year, and that created a lot of instability for planning, for even measuring. How do you know if something's working if you're changing it every year and you're using data from the year before that, right? So the stability in changing every 5 years but adjusting based on lessons learned annually is super important as well.
Well, I appreciate that there are things that you're finding really strong and really steady, and I am going to go look at your list of 10 just so we can applaud ourselves again. But this is a lot. It's big, it's complex. I don't mean to be glib or flip about this. This is a very significant undertaking, and there are bound to be things that we're should be cautious about, or that you look at and you think, that's probably going to be controversial or a problem or a capacity that you're going to need to really build. So I'm going to start with you, Brian. Give us a few of those, and then Kayla, you get a chance to add some.
So as I enter this response, I want to make it clear that what you have in Illinois and what a lot of other states have is what's generally called a base plus funding model, in which the funding that an institution gets is whatever they got last year plus some a percentage increase, often typically across the board, maybe related to like rising salaries or healthcare costs or whatever. That's what you've got. So as I pick apart what you're doing, I want to at least acknowledge that what you've got is not good for what the future requires. And not making some change here is a choice to maintain the status quo, which is going to lead to more inequities. And so with that being said, I would say I would make some distinctions. One is you already, within higher education, what you already have is a performance model, even if there's no performance in it. But the performance is based on enrolling students because they get their tuition, and there's some argument about base student per student funding and all that happens in the legislature. What you're going to get out of all this is a performance model, because the incentives that you create are going to differ from that set of incentives that I just described. What the objection is to performance funding is really an objection to outcomes-based performance. Like how does the student get served in the institution? At what rate do they graduate, et cetera, et cetera? And those, I don't have an objection with the challenges that Kayla articulated about those. But I'd say that outcomes-based funding is unlikely to work unless you have sorted out the fundamental adequacy requirement that each institution has. So if you slap on an outcomes-based performance funding model, you're likely to get perverse incentives that lead at best to a relatively similar amount of outcomes-based performance, and at worst, greater inequities that you might not be able to address with more targeted metrics and so on and so forth.
Which is what's been happening
Which is what's been happening in other states.
Which is why we didn't do it.
So, which is why getting at the adequacy piece, I think, first is really a vital way to go. But there are a whole bunch of unanswered questions about how this actually works. So I'll just quickly name a couple of them that I am going to be watching to see how Illinois sorts this out. One is, you have varying levels of institutional wealth that are unrelated to what the state appropriation is and what tuition revenue they generate to some degree. And so how do you address that reality? I have my perspective on how you might think about going about it. That's probably not going to be, we can have a big, robust conversation about that. That's one. Another is...
And when you say the wealth, you mean, are you talking about endowments
and the
ability to generate sort
I'm
of
talking
grant
about
dollars?
endowments primarily, but I'm also concerned about the extent to which institutions are able to penetrate markets outside of Illinois to generate tuition revenue over and at a premium that other institutions in the state have less ability to do. So those are real concerns. A second one is inevitably, I'll do three. Let me see if I can remember all three of them now that
Don't make it seem like there's such a long list and you're just choosing three, Brian.
I'll do three.
Okay.
The second one is some of is about the political process in two different ways, really. One is the termites are going to come out. You've now put a report out on the stump, and the stump is full of termites, and they're going to attack the report in various ways. One of which is going to be around the precision of the data that underlie all of those calculations that you've seen. I'm here to say that as an organization that created the predecessor to iPads, for those of you who know what iPads is, we created the predecessor for the federal government's data on higher education. So we are grounded in data. And we try extremely hard to be very precise about the data we use. We also find that precision can be a false idol in some respects. So instead of doing something useful, you're going to have people arguing about, well, did we get this number right to the cent or to the dollar or whatever? Ultimately, what you want to do is have a better conceptual framework that drives money where it's most needed. You ought not to care about decisions at the margin once those conceptual. So I want to fortify the legislators in the room and others to think about how much precision is generating no more marginal utility in the conversation that you have over how this thing rolls out. So that's one. The other is this model, the other concern I have, this model sets up a case that in which no institution suffers as a consequence of shifting to this funding model because they're all being held harmless. There might be something about increases on an annual basis to account for inflation. And that's all well and good when there's money available to the state budget. But what happens if the economy winds up in a recession that's been warned of for, 4 years now? If it's likely going to happen at some point, and there'll be less money. My argument is that this model still works for that case. It's just going to be harder to push through and to maintain the commitment to it under conditions of relatively lower dollar amounts. So just be prepared for those kinds of things. And so as you structure the conversation and how you sell this concept to a skeptical public or skeptical policymakers, that you leave room for the reality that some degree of retrenchment might be inevitable at some point because of state budgets. We've seen the trade-off between tuition and state funding. You've seen it. That's been happening, like Robin said, in every state in the country. How do you account for that? This model fortifies you against some of that, and I want you to just bear that in mind as you move forward. I have another one. I came up with a fourth, but I'll leave that one.
I appreciate. No, those are those are healthy cautions, and I think those really are going to be some of the conversations that we have. So I appreciate your take on that. Kayla, what would you add?
Yeah, I think you all saw the slide around the difference between how much funding it would take to reach adequacy in 15 years versus 10 years versus keeping it stable, right? And I worry about any system. In actuality, the outcomes-based funding model that was used for the 2-year system was not poorly constructed. It was not funded at all. We're talking $1,000, $2,000 allocations. True. That does not move and really does not help at the institutional level, right? So adequate funding into the adequacy funding model is necessary, and that's something that I fold into my second concern, which is concessions, right? Like, don't concede on the amount, but also oftentimes in negotiation and concession, equity is the first thing out the door, whether or not we call it that or are explicit about that. That is oftentimes where we back off in order to make other folks comfortable or different reasons, right? And the third is around like FTE and the way that like students are considered. I think it was pretty well thought out. I think FTE and Brian already mentioned endowment, like in terms of the options that were pursued. I think I often worry because we know that underrepresented students often enroll in different ways. They stop in and out and in different ways. So I think I want to see how that plays out. Yeah.
And that was a lively topic of conversation and may still be. So I appreciate that as well. Are we at the end? Do I have to? All right. There is so much more that we want to talk about, but I hope this gives you a good sense. This is not the last time that we're going to be bringing in folks to add some expertise to this conversation, but really appreciate it. I was going to close up by asking you to give us a grade on how you think this is going to go, but I'm not gonna put you to that because, but it's A's. I know it's A's. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, please join me in thanking Kayla and Brian for taking time. We didn't have time to take your questions because we've got a second panel that's really important to hear from, but I'm sure they won't have slipped out before we're done. So you can find them at that table right there. But I'm going to invite you guys to step down with a big thank you, and I'm going to introduce the person who's going to be moderating the next panel, who can then invite the next panel up. So I'm going to let you guys go by me. So I don't know Lisa, where are you? Okay. Lisa Castillo-Richmond, please join me up here. You are going to moderate the next panel. I'll let you introduce her. But Lisa Castillo-Richmond, for those who don't know her, is the executive director of the Partnership for College Completion. And she is deeply passionate about this work. She has been working both with institutions to work on how can they do a better job supporting all students and how can they learn from each other, but also on the policy side, including having been a commissioner for the last 2.5 years on the Commission for Public Education Funding. And if that's not enough, she is a hometown Illinoisan. She grew up just north of Rockford. And I think we want you to know that she is also a first-generation college goer herself. So Lisa, come join us and introduce us to the next panel.
So thank you all for bearing with us. We wanted to make sure you heard from a number of voices of critical stakeholders in this work. And so you're going to hear now from a student, from an institutional leader from one of our public universities, and from one of our advocates who also sat on the commission as well. So I'll have you guys go ahead and join me on the stage while I'm introducing you. So our first panelist is a student. Margarita Arango is also from Rockford, Illinois, actually, Northern Illinois, very represented on this panel. She's currently a second-year student at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she is majoring in public policy with a concentration in social policy and minoring in urban studies, history, and sociology. She serves as an ambassador for the UIC Honors College and the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. Additionally, she holds a position of co-president of the Student Advocacy Coalition on campus. She's participated in a number of things, including works with Young Invincibles. She is deeply passionate about promoting civic engagement and wants to get her master's in public policy. She's in a great room for this. So Dr. Corey Bradford is the Vice President of Administration and Finance at Governor State University. He has over 3 decades of experience in higher education. So as you can imagine, his bio is very long, so I'm going to hit some high points. He has an educational background in mathematics, business, statistics, and educational leadership. He is a graduate of a public university in Illinois, SIUC, and his contributions outside of his functional expertise extend beyond his administrative duties. He's a staunch advocate for diversity and inclusion in higher education, championing initiatives for equity and access for all. His commitment to student mentorship and development is very notable. Grateful to have him here as well. And finally, and notably pinch hitting for Senator Lightford on this panel today, I am really grateful to Sarah Labadie, who is the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Women Employed, a 50-year-old nonprofit advocacy and policy organization dedicated to improving the economic status of women and removing barriers to economic equity. Access to and success in higher education is a key strategy of Women Employed, and specifically to erasing inequity for women. Sarah helped draft the legislation, SB 815, that created the commission, and she has worked on issues related to higher education in Illinois for more than 15 years. Okay, so I don't talk nearly as quickly as Robin, but it would be really helpful right about now. So we do want to note that there are note cards and pens on your table, so we do encourage you to submit questions. Advanced Illinois staff will be walking around the room and can collect those if you all have some questions for anyone on this panel or anyone in the room, and also encourage you to stay after and have these conversations as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start my question for Dr. Bradford. As maybe some of you noted as the slides were flipping through a few minutes ago, Governor State University is at 44.5% adequacy. Right. So what's at stake with the commission's findings, and why can't we keep doing what we've been doing in terms of distributing funds to our public universities?
Well, thank you, Lisa. I think we're at a critical time in our state and in our nation. I think we have to look at how do we change, how do we evolve to meet the needs of today's students. Okay, today's students are not yesterday's students. Our students come from a variety of backgrounds, variety of ages, variety of working, taking care of a family. That's a total different type of higher education today. And so that old system that we have in place needs to change. So we can't continue to do the same old things and expect a different result, right? We've all heard that saying, right? And so we witnessed a great decline in state funding across this nation. We saw the skyrocketing of tuition costs across this nation. And we've seen the struggles of so many underrepresented students just to get into college, but it's even harder for them to get out of college. Okay? So that's why we need a change. Governor State, to me, is a case study of an equitable education funding system. We are the lowest funded state university in the state, yet we serve one of the most diverse population, adults, low income, first generation student population. You would think a state would want to make a greater investment in that type of institution. Do I get an amen on that?
Amen.
So I truly believe that this model can be a game changer for this state. Okay? I really mean it. It can be a game changer. I've been in several other states. I've been in Texas. I've been in Missouri. They said I've been around for 3 decades. And I think this model can really make a difference. It can impact all of our institutions and make it to where Illinois is the model where all students can be successful no matter their race, status, or class. Thank you.
Thank you. And in this model, for the first time, we would actually center students in the way state appropriations are distributed, consideration of students and the institutions that serve them. So Margarita, we heard from 2 different practitioners in the panel just before this, and they talked about the need for additional kinds of resources to provide services like advising, job training, tutoring. What are the types of supports and campus experiences that you need to have and students like you need to have?
Yeah, so luckily for me, I think my academics have actually been pretty smooth so far since coming to UIC, and I'm really grateful for that. But my advisors have literally been everything for me. And I don't think I could have gotten through any of this if it weren't for my advisors. I'm a part of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, CUPPA. It's the smallest undergraduate college at UIC. So luckily, our advisors aren't really spread too thin when it comes to the amount of students that they have. And we're able to have a really personal connection with our advisors. And I was reading up on an article from just last year that only 50 to 60% of college students actually utilize their advisors for things like getting advice on their coursework and things of that nature, which that's just unfathomable to me because I use them for everything. I have all my little spreadsheets open when I create my schedule and I do it all to a T, but I still make multiple appointments with my advisors to make sure that I'm good, right? I'm good. And it makes me sad that people aren't able to utilize their advisors in that way. And even at UIC, in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, I have friends who they can't reach their advisors for months because appointments are filling up. And UIC is relatively well-funded, so I don't really, if there's a huge gap like that even within the institution, I can't imagine what it's like at others. And also, thankfully, because of my advisors, I have them to thank for some really fantastic opportunities. I'd say I probably get sent at least 5 different internship opportunities a week from my advisor, if not more. It's usually more. And so I'm able to keep a running list, and they help. I've seen my advisors do mock interviews with students. They've helped me with letters of recommendation. So I have them to thank for everything. I've had internships with my state representative and with the Young Advocates program at YI, which was really, really incredible. So I have them to thank for everything.
Sarah, what excites you? We heard a ton of exciting things about the commission report and being at this critical juncture of moving to action now from the recommendations. So what makes you excited about these recommendations and what worries you?
I'm very excited that we're sort of walking the walk in Illinois and talking the talk in Illinois. I think it would have been very easy for us to say, the Illinois Board of Higher Education put out a Thriving Illinois, and that was enough for us on equity. That when we created the commission and the commission running was enough for us, and that's how we're going to address equity. That the report came out and the recommendations are out, and that's how we're going to address equity. But we're here today because we know that's not enough. So I'm very excited that this is a continuum. This isn't allowing us to say, hey, we've put equity into a recommendation, and that's going to be enough for us. I'm also so thrilled about how student-driven this work is. We're finally taking a look at our individual institutions to really understand what the student populations that they serve are and to figure out how to meet their unique student needs, and that it's dynamic. And I know we've talked a little bit about making sure that it's not changing year to year, but what it is really understanding that student population from year to year, and if it changes, making those according changes in how we fund it. Our institutions are very diverse. We've mentioned the missions are diverse, the student populations are diverse. We need a funding formula that's going to account for that, and I think this is a very, very strong starting point. And I'm really excited, the commission's job was really about adequacy, equity, and sustainability, or stability, and we met that challenge. So, we're on our way there. We met the commission's recommendations on that front. I will also mention predictability. That is the stability, sustainability, we have not had that in Illinois. I mean, we looked at that chart, you saw the deep dive, that was a very scary year, but we have not had predictable, sustainable, and stable funding for our higher education system, and it has borne the brunt of some of that. And so implementing a long-term strategy where we can see, what is the trajectory of our work here, and how will that impact the student population and our outcomes? And then, we do have a blueprint from K-12. We have some early childhood education funding work that we've done. I think we can take those blueprints, and my early childhood folks out there, we need to take, this needs to be a continuum. This is all where Robin talked about how, some of our K-12 underfunding has impacted what students are experiencing in higher ed, and that starts even in the early childhood system. And then finally, this system was built with a very particular student in mind. And as Dr. Bradford mentioned, that is not the student population we have now. So we need a funding formula that reflects the current student population and the needs of those current students. And we can think about how to address higher education in a whole new way. We are thinking about how to address higher education funding in a whole new way. And it's truly extremely exciting to think about that. I want to also mention, I'm not worried about anything, right? There are obstacles in our path, but I'm not worried about them. I think we have a brain trust in this room. We have a brain trust in the General Assembly. We have the support of the governor's office. I think we are incredibly well poised to make a real change in Illinois, but change is hard. Entrenchment is real. We have to be open to the idea that we want to do something different. We have to also, I know people have said 2 years, some people have said 2.5 years. I feel like for me, this has probably been longer because I helped draft some of that early legislation. So I'm going on 3.5 years. I did not spend that time to spin my wheels. I am dedicated to making this real, to getting a funding formula in Illinois, despite obstacles, despite challenges. I'm not worried about it.
Yes. Lots of amens in this room. So Dr. Bradford, Sarah talked about equity, adequacy, and stability. So stability is a big piece of this. We have inequitably distributed to institutions, absent of considerations about student populations, and inequitably cut funding to institutions over time, multiple decades of that as well. Can you talk a little bit about the stability piece of this and what that means for your institution and for your students?
Yeah, being a CFO, I'm always concerned about the financial stability of the institution, right? And so this is extremely important because it's very difficult to operate a university or a business if your funding is cut frequently or you are underfunded. And so what that instability causes, it causes harm to your academic programs and your support services that go to support students, okay? I believe that the adequacy approach will provide the necessary resources for all 12 public universities so they can address their specific student needs, okay? And to fulfill their specific unique missions, okay? That's the balance with this model. It does both. It addresses mission, purpose, and the students that you serve. I think that every public university will benefit from this model long term, because what we're talking about is the state making an annual commitment, okay, to fund every year for the next 10 to 15 years. That's the commitment we want. We don't want the approval of the model without the funding, okay? because then you have a formula that doesn't get the money. Okay? So what we're asking for is both. We want the model and we want the funding. Okay? And so that's the difference. But also it's important too, right? Because if you know what you're going to be getting over a 10-year run, an institution can budget better, they can plan better long term, they can build capacity, they can be more innovative, right? Just thinking, I know what I'm going to get, and tuition will be a lot more affordable, right?
And
go ahead.
And that's critical for students. Representative Ammons talked about that, about the sizable student population that have chosen to attend college outside of the state, the sizable student population that applies to college and then doesn't turn up on any of our campuses in the fall after they've been admitted to them, and students who don't even apply. So we know that there are tens of thousands of students across the state that could benefit from consistently excellent institutions from the tip of the southern part of the state up to the northern part of the state as well. So Margarita, so I'm giving everyone 2 more questions. So my question for you is there something that you wish you would have had on your campus or in your student experience, or what do you hope for future generations of students that will go through your institution?
So my hope for most students, and I think this goes hand in hand, I cannot answer both questions, is non-academic supports. I think that sometimes they go a little bit overlooked because, of course, the main purpose of a higher education institution is education, but for example, I live on campus, and sometimes the campus housing, it's overlooked. It's not prioritized as much as some other aspects of the university, and when your housing is not as ideal as it could be, or when you're having troubles with housing, I mean, that certainly impacts your ability to get your schoolwork done. I think there was a study done in 2020 that almost 45% of college students in the US are facing housing insecurity, and almost 15% are facing homelessness. That's not really acceptable, and I'm sure that obviously leads to students not being able to complete their work, not being able to go to class. I, for example, last year had we'll call it unfortunate situation with campus housing where there was a suspected infestation in the building. And from the moment that there was the suspicion, from the moment that we were told everything's okay, because there was nothing, thankfully, it was about a month. And so that was a month of not really sleeping very well because you're worried that something's going on in your building. I mean, that's a month of stress that definitely impacted my ability to show up to school and get my work done because there was just this cloud above me of things like that sucks. So definitely non-academic supports, I think, are crucial for students in being able to actually succeed academically as well.
Thank you. Okay, I have 2 minutes. I just got 15 questions from the audience.
Lightning round.
So unclear what I'm supposed to do with this, but I am seeing a few things coming up. And the first one, maybe Sarah has some thoughts on this, but we're getting a number of questions about community colleges and what does this mean for community colleges. So anything you want to say or any of our panelists want to say about that?
I mean, community colleges are obviously a key piece of the higher education structure here in Illinois, and I think this allows us to kind of start with the public university system and build on it for community colleges. Our community colleges are funded by formula, so there is a little bit of different transparency when it comes to how our community colleges are funded, but certainly there are going to be lessons learned from this work. And then secondly, while we're thinking about funding for higher education and the investment that we need to see in the public university funding formula, we can't forget that we need additional investment in the community college system as well. We can't, it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's making sure that all of our system is adequately funded to ensure that student success through the continuum.
And I'll add to that. So I see you clapping, Brian. Last year, PCC released a report on adequacy-based funding as a conceptual model, and this year we're releasing a report on the existing community college to base and equalization grant funding formulas to really elevate that conversation about these evidence-based models. As we know, in many other states, they are not two separate systems, and while they are two separate systems here, we understand that our community colleges serve even more undergraduates than our public universities, and they serve a far greater percentage of low-income students, first-generation college goers, Black and Latinx students, and we absolutely cannot leave them out of this conversation, even though they should be considered differently because they have these two formulas. So stay tuned on that as part of this longer conversation continues. One more? Okay, one more question. Okay, there are a few questions in this vein around accountability and outcomes and transparency. There's a number of questions about that. So if anyone wants to talk about that in that vein. And also, I think this speaks to kind of the bigger picture. We saw during the years of the budget impasse how vulnerable public institutions were because funding is considered discretionary. Will this formula help advocate for dedicated stream and non-discretionary funding as part of being equitable, adequate, and sustainable?
Yeah, I try to tackle, since I served on the subcommittee for the accountability group. So, yes, we think that's a critical part. You know, we think if the state's going to make the investment, then the university needs to be held accountable. Okay? Investment plus accountability leads to the outcomes we will all want to see, including the universities. We all want to see these outcomes. And so universities are accepting of the accountability, right? And so we're gonna do our best to deliver on those outcomes. So yes, there needs to be transparency. You need to know how we're spending these dollars. Okay? They're not coming in to be wasted. They're not coming in to be spent on administration. It's to be spent on helping our students be successful. Okay? Helping our communities be successful. It's about helping with the discovery, the research, the economic development of our state. That's what you need to hear from the universities, and we accept that responsibility just like we accept the money from the public.
Anybody else want to add any final thoughts?
I will just add that public transparency is important. So making it digestible for a wider range of public stakeholders is going to be important. Having that data go directly to IBHE and it's, like you've got a FOIA requested is probably not the way to go. We want to make sure that that is publicly available, that it's sort of simple to understand. That might involve reimagining some of our data systems, but the formula will and should provide for this, and this is what Brian was talking about. We need to fund the formula to make sure that those data systems are part of this as well.
Please join me in giving a round of applause.
All right, this always happens every year. I think, no, next year somehow magically we'll have time to do all of the conversation that we want to do. And every year we come up a little bit short, but only because the topics are rich and because the people that are willing to come and talk about them and ask questions are really engaged. So thank you very much. Lisa, a special thank you for moderating. There were also some last minute changes because Senator Light was going to participate. So just thank you. You've been so nimble and such a leader in this generally. So special thank you to you. That's deserved. That's deserved. And also a special thank you. If you enjoyed yourself this evening, any part of it, the food, the drink, the agenda, the wonderful people who were here, Jim O'Connor, if you would raise a hand. Jim captained everything. I want to thank the entire Advance Illinois team who has also greeted you. They've given you name cards. They've made sure that your food came, even if it had to come later. They've helped in every possible way. So thank you very much for all of that. And Senator Lightfoot was going to send us on our way with a rousing set of comments. So I'm going to channel my internal Kimberly Lightfoot, which is a little bit of a dangerous thing to do. Don't tell her I did this. But I just want to send you on your way with, I like to make sure everybody's having fun. And I want to make sure you're smiling and you're laughing. But this is serious stuff. This is serious stuff. And so I want to send us on our way with a couple of things to keep in mind. What's at stake here is our next generation. And it's not only them that you want to, you can picture people in your head that will benefit when we do our job right, when we get the dollars to our hardworking universities that they need to do the jobs they want to do. You can picture them. But the impact when we get it right is so much greater because that redounds to their family benefits. That redounds to their communities. That redounds to the whole state. When we invest in getting this right, all of us benefit. And we've been working really hard as a state to tackle early childhood. Just today, we're talking about finally bringing all of our early childhood work together into one agency. And we've worked there too to understand what should we be spending, and we're starting to march our way along. We've done the hard work in K-12. We've got a formula that is predicated on what do we need to get so our kids can really do well. Understanding they've got different needs and understanding that different districts have different needs. And we are marching along and we have become a national model. But we have not yet done that work in higher education, and it's time. And we've started, and I want to thank, there are a number of commissioners in this room, including some university presidents, who put over 2 years of personal time and energy into this. Because it matters, and it matters that we get it right. And I'm incredibly proud of this report. I think it's an incredibly strong start. I'm delighted that national experts agree with that. I'm delighted that you're hearing from students why they care and why they're paying attention. But we're not done. There's still stuff, if you read the report, when you read the report, not if, when you read the report, you'll see that there's still some areas we need to work out. We've got hard work ahead. So I'm going to send you on your way with the following asks. Agency leaders, please continue to step up. Please continue to be change agents. I'm incredibly impressed with the work that IBHE and its entire team did. It's not the time to ease up now. University leaders, you have incredibly hard jobs. I honestly don't know why anybody wants your job, but I'm incredibly grateful that you have them. And I'm looking at 2 of you right now who I've just really enjoyed working and rolling up sleeves with. Please stay engaged. This isn't the time to pull back. We've still got some of those thorny issues to work out. You know what they are. You know they matter. And I know you come with the right spirit. So remain open to change, remain engaged. Advocates, coalition members, you got to keep the pressure on. It is much easier to stick with the status quo. And as Brian said, the status quo is a choice. Let's not choose that. But it's always the course of least resistance that we choose. So we've got to keep the noise going. So advocates and those of you on the outside, keep the pressure on. Make sure people know you're paying attention. Students, you got to be heard. It matters what you think. We've tried to feature you at every stage. We tried to remember what it is that matters to you, the different kinds of experiences you have, because the student population now is different than back when I was 1,000,000 years ago going to college. And it should be. And we've got to adapt to that. So be heard. And legislators, this is the time to think big. We have done hard, big work, and we've become a national model in our early childhood, in our K-12. It's the time to do the same here. And I could make a glib remark about Missouri, but I won't, because it really is more serious than that. We owe it to the next generation to get this right. So take the time to do the homework, listen, learn, and then be ready to take the hard, significant actions that this moment requires. And with that, and on a slightly less light note than I've done on the rest of the evening, I really want to thank you for taking time out to get to know this. I really do commend that report to your attention. You'll find things to cheer and you'll find things that make you want to ask questions. Do both. And thank you very much. Good night.